Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Ruixue Jia. Hello, Professor Ruixue Jia.
Hello.
Ruixue, I am fond of your research, so it is my pleasure to be speaking to you on the show today. Your papers are really interesting and they're also unique. I interviewed one of your co-authors, Gerard Roland, some time ago.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I didn't know that. Okay, great.
Yeah, I interviewed Gerard. So, Rishi, we're going to be talking about China and the deep roots of development. And this is in light of a paper you wrote titled A Theory of Power Structure, China versus Europe. Rishi, do you know why this paper is interesting? Because your conclusions are a bit counterintuitive. We often assume that in an autocratic society, commoners will have fewer rights, but your research arrived at another conclusion.
Yes and no. I think one purpose of this study is to clarify rights or characterize rights more systematically. I think broadly speaking, when we talk about rights, uh, we often say, oh, look, like non-democracies or like China, where it's lack of rule of law, people have fewer rights. On the one hand, it's true. In particular, we characterize this as one dimension. If we think about the rights of the ruler versus that of the ruled, that's one dimension. But as I want to explain gradually, maybe in our discussion, this characterization itself may be not enough to explain many patterns. So, then another dimension we want to characterize is the rights between the elites and the people. In that sense, in the paper, we emphasize in a society like China, not only China, I would say, where actually the relationship between the elites and the people are relatively more fluid and more symmetric, even though the asymmetry lies more between the ruled and the ruler. And that would generate different equilibrium and could partly explain what we observe in the historical processes of China versus Europe.
Rishi, is it feasible for an autocratic leader to appease his followers?
Yes. So this in the so the follower is just one. The idea of the paper is trying to think about the followers into two different groups: the elites and the people. And the ruler or the autocratic leader can think about whom to appeal. In the paper, we argue that the Chinese case is where the ruler by using rights allocation are more likely to form alliance with the people, and that become they would more likely to have a political alliance, which makes the elites less likely to challenge the ruler. Whereas in like European federal society scenario, where in a simplistic way, you can think the people are more likely to belong to the elites, and the elites are more likely to compete with the ruler. And that creates another scenario and lead to different political outcomes, more political challenges and wars. And that's our key argument in the study.
Yes, Rishi, I read your paper and you referred to many stylized nuances. When I was reading your paper, I said to myself, is it that is it that the Chinese had an advantage because Imperial China lacked an aristocracy to function as a countervailing force to its authority?
I wouldn't think this is not one equilibrium dominate another equilibrium. If that's the case, then perhaps in the long run we would expect more convergence. In contrast, it's not. It's more subtle. So it's not that one simply better than the other. It's more like two ways of organizing the society. But from the ruler's perspective, the Chinese system is actually contributing more to the stability of autocratic rule, because once the ruler formed the alliance with the people, expecting these elites are less likely to challenge. Even external threats become less. So that's contribute to the stability of the ruler, but that's not necessarily best to the people. So it's when we think about good or better or worse, it depends on which class we are talking about.
All right then, because some often make the argument that in Europe there was a tripartite competition between the commoners, the noble class, and royalty. And in China, that equilibrium was absent, in the sense that China did not really have a strong noble class to confront that authority of the ruler. As you said, in China, hereditary privileges were abolished.
Yes, I would think but I want to just qualify your thinking. So the elite class was weaker in the Chinese case, but for the people, it's not that. It's definitely Chinese people more. You think about they face two dimensions. On the one hand, they face a more absolute ruler, which means they may be punished more severely if they defy the ruler, right? That affects whether they form the alliance with the ruler. But also they have this benefit side, is that they feel they have more chance to become elites. So there's this reward side. These two actually are complements and strengthening each other, makes the people more likely to follow the ruler. In another way to put it, suppose we went back to history and ask the people, in federal Europe versus the peasant China, it's not so clear. The peasant, if we tell them, look, these are the two societies, how they are organized, which would you like to exchange your society? It's not clear. The Chinese people might prefer the Chinese equilibrium because they get the benefit of becoming an elite.
All right. Ruixue, would you say that the imperial exam system placated ordinary people by making opportunities available to them?
This is one. So how do we? So we characterize this in an abstract way, but in reality, how this gets really realized. So the exam system is one example where ex ante every male feels that they have some hope to become the elite, and that's very critical. Even though exposed, the chance of someone to succeed is very, very small, but it creates this American dream in Imperial China, so that you feel you have a chance to become an elite. And that's very critical for stability. Through the lens of our framework, it's like this is a way you can think why the status between the elites and the people is more fluid.
All right. All right, Rishi. And this was not a major aspect of your paper, but tell us a little bit about primogeniture. Was prime is Does primogeniture impede wealth formation in families?
Yeah, so we discussed the exam system as one example to think about the status between elites and the people. Another way you can think is the inheritance rule. So in the Chinese case, since the Qin and Han dynasty, that like 200 BC, China used we call it partial inheritance rule, which means the males shared the inheritance. Whereas European federal society, the predominant is the primogeniture, which means the oldest male inherit the wealth. And it's rather, very intuitive, right? These two rules would have different implications on wealth accumulation. If the wealth could be inherited by one male, then it's easier to be accumulating. Whereas the wealth has to be shared across heirs, then it's less likely to be concentrating. And we take this as one, dimension, how this elite status was kind of regulated by different institutions in these two societies.
Ruixue, and again, your paper has so many captivating snippets. Comment on social mobility just briefly, because I read your paper in its entirety and you quoted that social mobility was actually more evident in Imperial China.
I want to be a bit careful here. So first is that if you look at the numbers, the exact way, today's whole measure, like the relationship between a parent and a child income, that's certainly not available historically. So for our main argument, we think this ex ante institution, like the exam system versus the federal society, the inheritable elite status, this ex ante measure is very, very important for shaping people's belief in social mobility. That said, if we don't have like comprehensive data to measure exposed social mobility, we just borrowed from historian studies. So the maybe most cited one is the study by Hebing Di. He studies the Chinese intergenerational mobility by looking at who become elite through the exam system in the Chinese case, whether their parents or grandparents got such a degree in the exam system versus who become a Cambridge, Oxford students in the 17th century. So it's certainly a very unfair comparison. This more historical China versus more modern, Europe. Even that, given this unfair comparison, he found that the Chinese case seems to be more people be able to come from a common background than the European case. So all that said, we want to emphasize this institution, the exactly this design of this mobility system is very critical. We have some scattered evidence based on exposed mobility, but to be able to really have very convincing and systematic quantitative comparison across society, it needs a lot more work to do.
Yes, Rishi, you know this paper quite well because I couldn't remember the name of the scholar you just referred to.
Oh, his name is Hebing Di. His book is called The Ladder of Success. He's a sociologist and a historian. So his life work is all about social mobility and the comparison between China and Europe.
Now I'm on the topic of the strength of the rule of law, and I want you to explain the relationship between the rule of law and the power of bureaucrats. In Imperial China, were bureaucrats respected or were they just the subjects of the king?
Yeah, so this is also one point. So there are two main points we want to deliver in this study. The first is just to add the dimension I mentioned before about the relationship between the elites and the people, which has not been much discussed in the political economy literature. The other thing we want to add is how do we think about rule of law, right? We often mentioned that, but it's unclear how we think about it conceptually. Here, we want to emphasize the rule of law matters is a kind of conditionality. What that means is whether you would be punished conditional on the occurrence where you defy the will of the ruler. So the Chinese bureaucrats or even today's elite, you can think that they have, they were treated pretty well and respected in normal times. What matters is in the critical moment when the ruler needs all your money, or when you betrayed the ruler decide not to like you anymore, then your rights lost in this in this system without rule of law because all your assets could be confiscated. So in that sense, that explains the puzzle why in normal times the Chinese elites are they live very good life and they are treated very well the investor a lot, become entrepreneur, but at the critical moment, that will become important, and that's what we want to highlight. So the way we think about rule of law is not like dividing the pie in normal times. It's more like in the moment where the ruler wants to punish you, and that make a big difference. You will be more severely punished in the Chinese scenario than the federal scenario in Europe.
All right. Rishi, I'm going to read an excerpt from your paper just to share it with our audience. As
Yes.
noted by many scholars, Chinese emperors were less constrained by rule of law. And I'm going to quote Feiner, because Samuel Feiner is really distinguished. As put by Feiner, all the ruled, including the top bureaucrats, were subjects, not citizens, and had only duties, not rights, as observed by Fukuyama and Unger. Law was only the positive law that the emperor himself made, and it could be as general or as particular as the policy objectives of the rulers might require. Now we're going to draw a contrast between China and Europe. In contrast, European rulers faced strong constraint from the Christian Church. Given the Pope's threat to delegitimize and excommunicate them, kings could not defy the Pope for very long, as shown in many examples. The king also faced much tighter legal constraints. In the famous words of Bracton, the king must be under the law because law makes the king. Having emerged from the 9th century customary law, a man's right to judge and resist when his king had acted unlawfully had been repeatedly recognized by significant legal documents through the Middle Ages. Importantly, this right was not subject to the king's justice and not upon the desires of the king. This statement, Rishi, is it, I've read it, but is it in a sense conflicting with the research? Because for the long run, it seems that eventually in Western Europe, people will get more rights.
Again, so that there's first a limitation of the study. We mainly compare federal Europe, compare with Imperial China. We are still thinking, so they stopped at like 16th century before Europe become a democracy, right? So then if we think about, how these two regimes, why one regime became democracy, the other not, we don't have a clear answer through this line of research. But the intuition, I think, is important, is the computation between the elites and the ruler that ultimately led to modern democracy. And that would lead to rise of people, right? But we are thinking more without, not about today's modern democracy. It's more about historical federal society versus imperial China. Then it's unclear, as I said before. It's like, on the one hand, it's true that you are more likely to be, the Chinese peasants more likely to lose their rights if they defy the ruler. But on the other hand, in normal times, it's unclear whether they lead a worse life. If you really want to think about modern society, because the Chinese institution persist, I think it's very stable, whereas the European institution experienced a lot of changes after the 16th century, where we can't explain everything. But if even you think of today, the Chinese people, why there's such a strong support for the ruler, it's like when they think about their rights, they not only think about the rights relatively to the ruler, but also think about their rights, relatively to the elites. I would even endeavor to for you to think about, like, now China is experiencing a lot of anti-elite movement, including anti-top like entrepreneur, and these kind of policies are somehow very popular. you could think this could be puzzling, right? Wouldn't an average citizen be very much worried that, oh, this actually affect my right? But they don't think this way. They think, oh, actually it's good to attack the elites because, in this, I think in people's mind, there's this two-dimensional rights. And that's even, still very, very relevant in understanding contemporary China. My light went off, so I turn it on. If you feel free to talk.
Yes, not a problem, Rishi.
Okay,
Oh,
good.
yeah,
Good.
I'll just wait, not a problem. Rishi, it's like game theory, or what we would call the rational actors model. Most people don't want to be led by an autocrat, but if the autocrat is willing to provide privileges, then they're going to support his rule.
Yes, in that sense, yes. It's like one way to think about this. This is a model or a way of thinking about populism. Right? Nowadays, we talk about populism as if it's a new thing, but I would think the Chinese regime from history to today is a type of populism that where, as because the two forces, people actually are more likely to be aligned with the ruler and support the ruler. And that's is beneficial for rulers' autocratic rule, but it's not unclear it's necessary benefit to the people or the nation. Yeah.
People like politicians who deliver. So Xi Jinping may be criticized, but he can always argue that the Chinese economy is growing. So if you're delivering, people are going to like you. It's that simple. In Western countries, they may have greater levels of freedom, but some of their politicians could be more unimpressive. So from a cost benefit analysis, I prefer to live in a free society. But if the leader is delivering like a Lee Kuan Yew, that's not a problem.
Uh, Yes, I think in normal times, yes, I agree. And that's also one message you could extend from our model on history. That said, what's is coming back. I think the rights are still important. They are important not in normal time. It's more in terms, if you defy the ruler, then you will see, oh, at that moment, it's actually critical for you as an individual, whether you have rule of law or not.
All right, now we're going to switch the debate a little by talking about land ownership. What was the nature of land ownership like in Imperial China?
Yeah, so this, of course, we're at risk of simplification, but you can roughly think from 6th century, the Chinese system is more have, the peasants, they are poor, right? But they are relatively have enjoy more autonomy and they have small plot of land to work on. And in contrast, in Federal Europe, the land concentration was much more severe, right? And they're also, the serfdom was still a very important institution for a long time. So that's another dimension we use to think about the relationship between the elites and the people. If you think about the Chinese peasant, they are like more like autonomy, poor, but has more autonomy on their own, working in their own field, where the federal in federal society, these people are more likely basically owned by their laws, and that's another dimension reflecting the elite people relationship. And there's some again, the quantitative number are not very systematic, but there's some numbers mainly focused on the 16th and the 17th century. At that time, some European figure, it was like 70% of the land was concentrated in the gentry class, where the Chinese case, based on the historic records we can, read that more like, from 6th century onward, it's less than 40 to 50% of the land were owned by those large landlords.
Rishi, throughout our discourse, you have been employing an interesting phrase, normal times. And let me explain by reading. While land could be owned by individuals in normal times in China, the ultimate legitimacy of land ownership was always reserved for the ruler. So the emperor could re-centralize the ownership when he deemed it necessary.
Yes, so we see this, the land confiscation it also happened in European case, but much rare, like Edward VIII, some in London now. There's some examples, but it's rare. Whereas in the Chinese case, it repeatedly happened. You know, when a new emperor came, or even the new Communist Party, you know, just came to power, the first thing they did is to confiscate the land of the elites and redistribute it to the people. So that's the, you know, the classical critical moment. Also, when there external war, then when the emperor needs money, what he usually did is to come to some merchants, like there's famous like salt merchants in Yangzhou, and he would come to them to say, oh, you know, you need to finance me. And this offered extreme contrast, right? In the England case, we know that how the financing of war actually contributed to the right sharing with the merchant class. In the Chinese case, because of, you know, this what we talk about, the rise at the critical moment, the ruler didn't need to really make concessions or rise to the elites. They just get the assets and the wealth from the elites.
I think that it is crucial for me to share this snippet with our audience. In contrast, when European rulers needed revenues, they could usually not confiscate land from the elites or the church. Instead, they had to exchange rights or resources with revenues. Levy 1988 states it clearly. During the medieval period, a monarch was expected to live of his own. That is, funds for the monarch were to come from royal land and customary dues. Should monarchs need more, even if it was to fund a campaign on behalf of the country as a whole, they had to obtain assent to they had to obtain assent to some form of extraordinary taxation. They could neither expropriate property at will nor rely on a regular levy.
Yes, I think, yes, I think, you know, even though this kind of characterization always miss some detailed nuance, but I think they are roughly capture the big picture differences between the two society. Yeah.
Your paper is bigger than comparing up than positing a theory of power structure and institutional compatibility. It is reading like the institutional and cultural history of Europe. This is one of the reasons why I enjoy it.
I also enjoyed working on it. I can't pretend I'm expert of Europe. I
Yeah.
certainly know much more about China, but in this process, I read a lot of books thanks to the pandemic. So I am still learning. So it's kind of also an interesting learning process to work on this issue.
Rishi,
Yes.
was punishment harsh in Imperial China?
Uh, yes, if you compare, if you see the cases, suppose you know, punishment could be very general. When I say confiscation of assets, right, that's very, very severe punishment if all your assets can be confiscated. Then, of course, that's narrow, even based on narrow definition. If you betrayed the ruler, and then you not only yourself would be punished, all your family members would be punished too. To give you maybe a bit more extreme example, is that there's this famous scholar called Fang Xiaoru. So he kind of offended the ruler because the ruler wants him to write an article in praise of the legitimacy of the new ruler, but he disobeyed. So what's the punishment? Is he was killed, or his family members, relatives was killed, but it went even beyond another layer. It's called, so all the people basically have 9 steps lengths with him were killed. And that's not enough. The ruler said we should do the 10th degree, which means his students were also killed. You know, this is certainly like, you know, no rule of law in terms of this. It's not an individual would be punished. Whereas these cases are much less, you know, common in the European case, right? And we read a bit about the writing of attenders. If you betrayed the ruler, in principle, you were punished. But in many cases, these people were relieved later too. And that's, you know, related to how the rule of law was really played a rule at this kind of special critical moment.
Rishi, I'm happy. You said that you know more about China than Europe. More than likely, I know more about Europe than China. But
Right.
I'm often impressed by this term legalism, or the phrase ruled by law. If you have any knowledge of legalism, could you just shed some light on it, please?
Oh, legalism. So you usually use very often for people who don't know much about China. When you think about Chinese culture or institution, you often think about Confucianism, right? But in reality, since the real Confucianism, we're not talking about punishment. It's more about ruling by moral standard. It's just ancient idea. In fact, since the war, kingdom period, warring states in China, in those period, there's this legalism which the representative scholar is called Shangyang. So that is like, oh, we'll have law and it will punish. The law would punish commoners or the ruled class very severely, and their rules, but these rules didn't apply to the ruler. It more applied to the ruled class, and it's very severely implemented so that to make people follow the order. So the key idea of the legalism is to create a social order and hierarchy by law and implement punishment very, very severely. Anecdotal evidence suggests that actually Mao Zedong is heavily influenced by the idea of legalism. But these are all based on like anecdotal and historical narratives. But I think people would agree to this China institution. If you think about what are the ideas that drives the current system, is a mixture of Confucianism and legalism.
Rishi, is Confucianism really promoting conformism, or is this an embellishment?
So I think it's a little bit, it promotes many things. So it's like I'm a bit skeptical about the simple interpretation of Confucianism because it involves many, many dimensions. I think over the history, we know that rulers often picked the dimension that really facilitated his rule. And then the one about hierarchy and conformity was kind of promoted because it helps stability and obedience. But if you really think about the thought, I think it's much richer. It also promotes democracy and other, mutual respect, etc. But not, it depends on, which ruler emphasize which dimension. It's just over time, the dimension about conformity and the hierarchy was more likely to be kept through this political process.
Usually, researchers argue that conformity is incompatible with innovation, and for the most part, they are correct. But if one is conforming to hard work and the rule of law, this is a positive consequence of conformity. So, for instance, East Asian countries, they are less individualistic than countries in Western Europe and America. However, they value hard work. Therefore, if the national culture is encouraging conformity by promoting hard work, this is a plus for development.
Yes, I think I agree. I don't think the East Asian culture, Confucianism, is necessarily bad for development or for innovation. I'm skeptical about this kind of culture determining I think it plays a role, but it's through a lot of interaction with the incentive system and the institutions. Just give it always, this just the standalone explanation just can't explain the China's growth, right? Well, it's more about, with the institutional change or with the economic reform that get people's incentive correct or more productive, then actually culture could facilitate the economic development too. So yeah. So I totally agree with you in this aspect.
And then look at the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was exceptionally innovative.
Uh, yes. That said, yes, that's what there a lot of writing about the divergence between China and Europe, and many. If you ask, interestingly, I heard such a kind of anecdote. If you ask people interested in China, especially historians, which dynasty would they prefer to returning to? I think most of them would choose Song Dynasty. But on the one hand, yeah, it's supposed to be very creative regime, but also I have to say that's before the what we call new Confucianism. So after the Song Dynasty, the exam system become very, very prosperous, but also very, very rigid and standardized. Uh, and that actually maybe hurts some diversity in thinking and in, I don't know, creating new thoughts. Yeah, so, but I'm not saying that. So I totally agree with you that I wouldn't say that the Chinese culture is, necessarily bad for innovation. That I certainly don't agree.
Rishi, you seem to be a skeptic of many perspectives. Are you also skeptical of the argument that the system of imperial education in China delayed innovation by promoting conformity? Quite frequently, it is debated in books written by Western scholars that the imperial system blocked innovation.
Uh, I would think this is just one uh, factor interacting with many other factors. It's just the ruler is a tall political regime pursuing stability, emphasize stability much more than all the other dimension of economic development. Then, naturally, if you want to select people just based on certain contents, this system give you, this is a very efficient system, right? All this hierarchy, people work very hard, then this naturally wouldn't produce innovation because this is not what the political regime wants. But as you see, right, if the political regime wants to have scientists and reward the scientists, then this system can be used to select talent. If the system was selecting mathematician, then it will produce mathematicians. So I wouldn't use this kind of as one, you just the explanation, because the question you talk about the outcome about innovation and the greater divergence is certainly overdetermined. So I am not skeptical of the fact the lack of innovation in China for the imperial part, especially after 1500. I'm more skeptical using just one factor to explain that change.
I like your responses to these counter arguments. So I'm going to introduce another counter argument. There is also the idea that the curriculum of the imperial system was incompatible with an industrial economy. It emphasized ideologies and philosophies instead of technical science. Do you share this opinion?
Yes, I think that's true. That's true. The contents. I also think that the contents matter. Even today, this system is very much parallel to the college entrance exam. Uh, I can be, I was actually in this summer. I've been living with a high school student in the U.S. and learned more about how math was is taught in the US like elite high school. I think it's just very impressive. Whereas even in my own experience, how math was taught in China, not to mention the historical one with no math. Even today, I think there are a lot of scope for improvement. There's too much emphasis on reciting the contents, too little explanation about the underlying logic. And this certainly even true, even more so in historical things, because the tests are based on the classical test. and you write essays, and this become even more stricter in the Ming and Song dynasty. That's after Ming and Qing dynasty. That's after the Song dynasty. I think these things do matter. Yeah.
Rishi, were you born in China?
Yes, I was born in China.
Great. So you can give us first-hand examples. Every now and then I interview an academic from the United States, and these academics usually encounter Chinese students, and they argue that the Chinese students are really brilliant, but not adept at lateral thinking or analyzing ideas outside of the box. What is your experience what is your experience as someone who lived in China? Is this just a
Mm,
stereotype or is it true?
I think it's partly a stereotype, but also it's partly that it's a self-strengthening equilibrium. There's stigma, and the Chinese education system indeed didn't encourage students to challenge the authority. A good student is supposed to be quiet in class, but when you really wrote the exam, when the result is out, you are the best. So this conditional culture encourage deep thinker rather than talker. uh, I think this is also change very fast. The young generation has less such a burden, and they are actually quite creative. I just feel, as I also teach in the US, I feel there's such a stigma among the Chinese students. I always said there's no need to have such a stigma. Uh, and I think this sense would change real fast with the new generation of students. You see, I don't know whether you know them, but they are not afraid of challenging authorities anymore. And this is just a generation gap, I think.
Okay. All right then. Rishi, some are also contending that Chinese companies are not as innovative as how we would expect them to be. I've actually cited some of these studies in my research. I know that your field is economics and history, but as a economist, are you making any prediction for the future productivity or innovation of Chinese firms, or do you agree with the argument that in China, innovation is still perceived as a threat on some levels?
Uh, I have been following the innovation in recent years in China. The reason I'm interested in history is driven by this big fact that why industrial revolution happened in the UK, not in China, and that led to the great divergence, etc. And I think in my life experience, I might be able to see whether there will be an industrial revolution in China. Uh, I think I'm generally optimistic about the fundamental economic factors, the human capital. I don't think Chinese students are not creative. I think that's a stigma. Physical capital, China has a lot of money and savings. Um, and I'm more the pessimistic, or the worry I have is more about the political factors. If politics goes well and there's no big political upheaval or something, then I'm rather optimistic. If you look at the patents data, not only the number of patents, but even the highly cited patents, etc., China has performed very well. So I would think China has been on the right track. It just politics is always the factor that creates all the unexpected consequences in this society.
I agree that the Chinese are producing patents, but Scott Kennedy and the people at CSIS and other writers, they have argued that the patents are of a low quality. And when we look at the intellectual property trade deficit, the surplus is in favor of America.
Yeah, so I also look at this data. It's true that a lot of the Chinese patents are of low quality, but you should look at the trend, right? If you look at the high cited patents, their increased trend is still very impressive. And in certain fields, that as we know, like AI, material science, etc., China has been making really great progress. In fact, my summer project, or as I have been interviewing scientists to understand how the U.S.-China conflict affect their collaboration, etc. Especially with China, and how that how they think about China's science progress in different fields, especially in biology and engineering. So even based on my interview with those scientists in the U.S., my understanding is, it's just nothing so worth worrying about the potential growth of China's innovation, except for the politics.
And China has a superb edge in human capital.
Yes, I think that's really impressive. I will, given that, as you said, first the Chinese students or young people are working so hard, and I don't think they have any downside in terms of creativity. So it certainly should, the country should grow and innovate. But sometimes it's just that this uncontrolled political economy could really matter. Now I think maybe I haven't been to China for too long due to the pandemic, and all the news about the politics in the past few months doesn't sound very encouraging.
Not at all. The issue with Jack Ma is quite daunting.
Yes, and that's related to the history we talk about, right? It's a kind of very interesting that average citizen welcome this kind of policy. As I explained, they see this as a way of anti-elites. Instead of say this as a way of anti-property rights of every citizen. And that's the the theory or the understanding of the Chinese society we want to really highlight. Yeah.
The Chinese state must mature by becoming receptive to disruption instead of trying to manage change.
The state is actively managing change, I would say, but the whether the policies are the correct way, I'm more pessimistic by the recent policy changes, which doesn't make sense to me. That said, that like maybe many other society, Chinese politics swing a lot. It's like swing a lot toward the right, then it would correct to become a bit central, and now it swing a lot to the left. I hope it would swing back. So
Yeah, I agree to innovation is naturally disruptive, Riche. Therefore, if one is serious about exploiting the gains of innovation, promote what libertarians in America call spontaneous order. The state should not be too quick to regulate or over-regulate infant sectors. And this is my problem with the present trajectory of the Chinese state.
yeah, I also agree that the state seems to do too much regulation in the past summer. That said, the Chinese is also a type of economy we kind of typically summarize as the state capitalism. So and the one want to see that the state is really kind of powerful and works as a coordinating system. So when the state decide to have certain industrial policy, all the private money respond a lot. So we see all this complementarity between the public sector and the private sector, which is a good thing if it's used in the right way, but it also leads to a lot of waste and distortion.
And however, Rishi, we cannot be ahistorical. Remember, China represents an unbroken civilization. So the Chinese state has greater expertise in containing disruption than other states. So I am not surprised at the actions of the current Chinese state.
Yes, yes. Now it's on the one hand from political control perspective. Yes, the state likes to do this for its own stability and power, but you still think there could be a counterfactual which we think might be good for the country too, is to be less have less regulation and let the market decide a bit more. Yeah, so that I was puzzled about the decision making, especially in terms of the recent policy changes.
Rishi, are you an ideological person? Would you say that you're on the left or the right?
It depends on the. I'm in the UK now, so and I think there's a lot of standards. I would think I'm central toward the left, but that's I think based on the European standard is already a little bit right. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm a libertarian, but I do get your point. You are on the left in the sense that you prefer a social market economy. You're not a communist or anything like that.
Right. I know you are at the Mises Institute. I know.
Well, it's interesting that you actually did some research on the Mises Institute. One economist, he shall remain nameless. He's exceptionally distinguished, a remarkable scholar. I sent him an email requesting a conversation, and he said, "Well, I like your show. You seem interesting, but I don't like F.A. Hayek."
Yes,
And he
yes.
did not appear.
Yeah, I know. It's think about depends on your ideology. I don't have such a strong that view that's so strong that I wouldn't talk with the people on the right. But it's just amazing to think about our ideas, how ideas affect our actions and our view about the world, right?
But
Um, yeah.
the image of F.A. Hayek animating public discourse is a caricature. F.A. Hayek was an acerbic critic of the government, but he was not as aggressive as Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard was actually a critic of F.A. Hayek. F.A. Hayek supported minimal welfare.
I think they are taken. If you read it, I haven't got chance to read every classical very carefully, but I have this general impression that they are kind of their views are more usually a bit more nuanced than what people just take as their viewpoints. But anyways, I'm at LC now, so it's where Hayek met Keynes, etc. So it's interesting intellectual history to think about.
Yes, and the debate with Oscar Lange, fascinating time. So,
Yeah.
are you a professor at LSE or a visiting academic?
I'm visiting this year. Yes.
Okay, you're visiting academics. So,
Yes.
well, look, but are you still using your email from the US for people who'd
Yes.
like to contact you? Good, because that's how we got in contact.
Yes. Yes. I still use it.
All right, so Rishi, you also wrote a second paper that's equally compelling, doing business in China. Parental background and government intervention determines who becomes an entrepreneur, who owns a business, sorry.
Yes. Uh, I think it's generally related to the theme we have talking about. And so this is come to modern China and think about entrepreneurship and business and even innovation maybe in the future. It's a society where the state is very powerful. So as I said, the private sectors and actors also want to be closer to the state. And this is certainly reflected by doing business. Meanwhile, China is huge, right? There are different regions, almost like slightly different ways of capitalism. The variable that determines the differences is the rule of government intervention in the economy. So the paper is very simple. On the one hand, it shows or confirms this typical conjecture that the children of the government workers and the bureaucrats do have some average advantage in creating business. However, this actually varies greatly across Chinese provinces because in some province it's more like American capitalism maybe. In other provinces it has more state intervention, and in the province where there's much more state intervention, disadvantage or the we call them key-draw children. So the children with key-draw parents has much more advantage in doing business.
Rishi, is entrepreneurship a consequence of the network effect? If your parent is a government bureaucrat, he or she would have access to more social capital, contracts, and influential politicians. So is this one of the reasons why the children of government bureaucrats are likely to become entrepreneurs?
Yes, it's one of the reasons. Of course, there could be other reasons like information, business opportunity, etc. I think it's not a surprise. Every society there's a intergenerational link. If you have entrepreneur parents, you are more likely to become entrepreneur because of network, information, etc. Here is just an economy where the state is so critical, so it's have this cross occupation benefit. If your parents is a government worker, actually you are more likely to own business.
Rishi, I am a bit familiar with the research on the link between entrepreneurship and genes, and some suggest that the transmission is partially genetic. Do you have an opinion on the genetics of entrepreneurship? I'm not an expert in the area either. I would just want to know your views.
Uh, so you think about the entrepreneur parents, entrepreneur children, maybe there's some genes that going on, and yet we are not looking at this. We are looking at this cross occupation, right? This, suppose you are a government worker, you are natural, maybe your genes makes you become government worker. That seems more intuitive. But how could you become, how could you get entrepreneur genes? That's less intuitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So your argument is enunciating a greater case against genetics because government workers are not really entrepreneurial.
Yeah, it's not, in this case, it's certainly, I think, difficult for genes to explain our finding. That said, it's not to say that genes do not matter. It could matter in occupation choice. It just can't explain this finding.
Yes, I share that assumption too. I am not one of those culturalists who are critical of genetic explanations.
Yeah, I am also very, very curious because there seems to be some recent book I haven't read talking about the importance of genetics in shaping intergenerational mobility, etc. I haven't really read them. Yeah.
Yeah, Nicholas Wade has a book, and there are many empirical studies looking at the nexus between genes, intelligence, and personality traits. I've
Ah, okay.
actually I've interviewed several researchers in the field of intelligence.
Okay. And what's their
I,
view?
IQ is highly heritable, and all personality traits are heritable.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I'm very curious because actually I was adopted. So, so this kind of identity makes you wonder how and where is my genes influence my fate. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm very curious.
since you're adopted, the consensus in research is that the personalities of adopted children are closer to their biological parents.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Interesting to
Yeah,
know.
so if your real parents were scholars, more than likely you're going to be a scholar.
Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know. I'll explore that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rishi,
Yes.
chronism, is that a major problem in China, or is it another exaggeration?
It is. I think it is a very important problem because it's also related to corruption and other, social and political problems. And it's also related to what we talk about, lack of rule of law. is that this is a little bit cliche, but they play a role in there's a fascinating nowadays, like there are a lot of news, and there recently the news is about someone who was a lady who was kind of met I think she was drunk, and she was stopped by a police officer. And then this is a online thing. Everyone in principle would see she was stopped, but she didn't realize that because she was drunk. And then she said, "Oh, please find this guy." So he gave a name, let him to come to save her. And that guy, everyone was talking about this guy online now, because that guy is the head of the police. So it's become a notorious piece of news online. But it just says, this way of thinking. When you met a problem or when you start a business, the first thing you think about is, oh, can I find someone I know or I indirectly know? And you can imagine this kind of thinking and this kind of organizing economy certainly creates a lot of distortion and the misallocation of talent and the capital, etc.
Misallocation of talent. This is for another debate. Industrial policy leads to the misallocation of talent. We often refer to resources, but we're really talking about talent. So for instance, because of industrial policy, perverse incentives may be created for a manufacturer to invest in energy, but his skills are better utilized in manufacturing. So this is a misallocation of talent.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. It's like, and that's another big thing when we talk about China's innovation, is how effective or efficient the Chinese industrial policies are. It's unclear because it's very difficult to study. It's very complicated. But I'm trying to, just
Yeah, I have
gradually
a,
understand. Yeah.
yeah, I have a piece on industrial policy for the Mises Institute. You can go and read it. But Rishi, I enjoy our discussion, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. I'm keeping guests for 1 hour these days, or maybe less. But it was a pleasure to speak to you, Rishi.
Yeah,
Bye.
it's a lot of fun. Okay,
Yeah,
bye.
all right, bye.
Yeah, bye.